Hello, and welcome to Wesley Family Services Behavioral Data Collection Training. I'm Nate Beers. I'm a behavior specialist here at Wesley, and today I'm going to train you on why behavioral data matters and how to collect it quickly, accurately, as painlessly as possible. By the end of this training, you should be able to recognize the importance of behavioral data, and you should be able to accurately fill out a scatter plot and an ABC data chart. Here at Wesley, we are on a mission to empower adults, children, and families we serve by providing transformational care. When it comes to behavior supports, an important component of transformational care is the effective use of data collection. The data we collect is used to create, to measure, modify, and adjust the behavior support plans, which directly impact the quality of life for those we serve. Now, I recognize that most of you probably didn't wake up this morning with this thought. However, maybe by the end of the training, that will be your thought. Regardless, the training is about our specific expectations for our direct support professionals whenever behavior supports are involved. And so, please pay attention because it's very specific to our agency. If you have any questions or complaints about this training, you can feel free to reach out to me. Just email me at nate.beers@wfspa.org. Or if you have compliments, actually you can reach me on my other email address. It's doug.muetzel@wfspa.org. And if you could just include for those emails on the subject line, #BestTrainingEver, that would be great. Now we'll take a look at why behavioral data matters. Let's consider the case of David. David's a 27-year-old man with autism and mild intellectual disability, and he's living in a group home. While David had occasionally yelled at staff in the past, recently his yelling had increased a lot, so a referral was made to a behavior specialist. The residential supervisor explained it this way: David's been yelling a whole lot, and it seems like every time the staff try to take him on an outing, he flips out. He's been yelling when staff ask him to do his chores or get a shower. It's been making his housemates get really stressed, not to mention my staff are getting worn out. The behavior specialist decided to begin having the staff collect behavioral data using an ABC data chart. 2 weeks later, the behavior specialist reviewed the data and discovered that when certain staff were on shift, David yelled until he was no longer, quote, forced to go on an outing or get a shower or complete the chore. In other words, his behavior of yelling served to the function of getting him out of non-preferred activities. Then the behavior specialist was able to set up a behavior support plan in which David would no longer get out of doing things by yelling, but instead he was given more choices regarding the start time of his chores and his shower, and he was given increased choices on the type of outings. Also, the staff members who experienced the most yelling were instructed on how to use verbal prompts to help David with transitions before an outing began and before he was asked to do a chore. Within a week, David's yelling behavior was significantly reduced. And within 3 weeks, the house supervisor reported, David is doing great. He still yells sometimes, but it's so much less than before. And how did this dramatic behavior change take place? Well, the behavior specialist used data collected by direct support professionals to figure out the function of the behavior, and then instructed staff on how to change several aspects of David's environment, which in turn dramatically decreased his yelling behavior. Now let's consider the case of Audrey. Audrey is a 78-year-old woman with moderate intellectual disability who attends a day program during the day, and she just started using a wheelchair the majority of the time about 2 years ago. Then, just 2 months ago, a behavior specialist started working with Audrey because of increased bouts of crying and intermittent pinching of staff. The behavior specialist trained the direct support professionals on how to collect data using a scatter plot, which showed the time of day that each behavior took place. The scatter plot revealed that the pinching usually happened right before transitions during the 30 minutes prior to leaving the day program in the mornings and during the last 30 minutes of the day program before coming home. The scatter plot also revealed that the crying took place most frequently during the shift of one particular staff member who happened to be quick to attend to Audrey whenever she needed anything. The behavior specialist used this data to create a behavior support plan to address the specific functions of both behaviors. Staff started using a visual timer to help prepare Audrey before leaving to and from the day program, and this alone reduced the pinching behavior. Also, the attentive staff member was instructed to no longer respond to the crying, but instead to respond when Audrey called to her in an appropriate manner. Within 4 weeks, both problem behaviors had significantly been reduced, and the ongoing data collection revealed this reduction in behaviors. Another success for behavioral data collection and interventions. Data matters. You might be tired of all the trainings, you might be tired of all the paperwork, but here's the deal. Data really matters. If you think about David or Audrey, it was the good data collection that led to the good behavioral interventions, and that's what increased their quality of life. Behavioral data reveals to me or to other behavior specialists what's working, what's not working, and often can point to the function of the behavior, like why someone's behaving the way they are. Specifically, behavioral data collection provides an objective standard for behavior change. It's definitely different than just showing up one day and having one staff member say, well, he's been doing great lately, and then have a conversation with another staff member maybe the very next day saying, oh man, has he been acting up? See, the behavioral data actually shows what has been happening or what hasn't been happening, and it provides that objective standard. Another thing with behavioral data is that it points to and often can reveal the function of the behavior. It can reveal why someone's doing what they're doing. And lastly, behavioral data shows if an intervention is working and how well it's working. I can tell you there have been times when upon implementing an intervention, there is immediate effective change, and it's awesome. And there are also times when we've tried an intervention and it hasn't worked. Well, how do we know whether or not it was working or wasn't working? We looked at the behavioral data. That's what told us the story. And if I haven't said this enough, let me say it again. The data really matters. It's like taking blood pressure for someone that's got hypertension or checking blood sugar for someone with diabetes. It's telling us a story. It's revealing how someone is doing. And it will make a big difference in the decisions that are made for their care. Now it's your turn with a knowledge check. See if you can figure out which one of these statements is false before the time runs out. Ready? Go. So, did you get it right? Keep track of your score throughout the training and see if you can make it to the end with no wrong answers. For this one, I hope you realize that we definitely continue behavioral data collection because it lets us know if the intervention is working. What is behavioral data collection? To me, this term actually could sound pretty intimidating. It's almost as if someone were talking to me and they said, referring to math, please use the standard parametrization to solve the quadratic equation. I would be like, what are you talking about? And I do not want it to be that way when it comes to collecting behavioral data. And the good news is it doesn't have to be. Simply put, behavioral data collection is making a written record for specific behaviors displayed by an individual. For our clients, there are certain behaviors, target behaviors, that we are seeking to increase, such as proper hand washing, or to decrease, such as yelling. And behavioral data collection is creating a written record of every time that the person displays the target behavior, or perhaps creating a written record of what happened right before and right after the target behavior was displayed. So, just for fun, and in case you're not already having enough fun, I'm going to have you observe behavior that I display. The target behavior is clapping. Pay attention to what happens before and after. You can keep track of how many times I clap. Sound good? Here we go. Okay, so if we asked you how many times did he clap, the answer would be 4. I clapped 4 times. And if the question was what happened right before, he put his hand on his chin. What happened right after? he kind of made this weird yelling sound. That is all that will be asked of you when it comes to behavioral data collection. You're either going to be recording whether or not it did occur and when it occurred, which is a scatter plot. I'll be covering that in a few minutes. Or you'll be asked what happened right before the behavior, what happened right after the behavior. And that'd be like an ABC data collection sheet. So let's dive in. Scatter plots! One of the most common types of data collection used is a scatter plot. Here is an example of one. You'll notice that there's a lot of boxes. So let's look at each part. The top should display the date. Please fill it out accurately so we know which dates the scatter plot is tracking. On the left side of a scatter plot shows the time of day, often broken down into 30-minute segments. So each box in the scatter plot is representing one 30-minute interval or segment of the day, and it's on the date that is listed at the top. The bottom of the scatter plot has a list of target behaviors with numbers corresponding to each behavior. That way, when you're writing in the small boxes, you can just write the number of the behavior rather than having to write the words in those small boxes. Also, there's a spot to add a behavior, so if a client starts doing another problematic behavior, feel free to add it to the key at the bottom and begin recording it in the scatter plot. Here are the steps of how to fill out a scatter plot. Step 1 is to know the target behavior or behaviors. Now this sounds overly easy, but actually sometimes it is that easy, but sometimes it's not that clear. If the target behavior, for example, was yelling, like if the client says, la 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 la, is that yelling or is that just playful singing? Does yelling mean that they have to be screaming profanity at one of their housemates or at a staff? So knowing the definition of like what counts as the behavior and what doesn't count as the target behavior is very important. Largely that rests on the behavior specialist or your supervisor to help clarify, is this an example of the target behavior? Is this not an example? But in order to have any effective data collection, we have to be agreeing on what it is that we're actually observing. So that's step 1, know the target behavior. Step 2 is observe. This is just what would happen throughout your shift as you're doing what you're supposed to be doing at work, and you observe what the clients do. Step 3 is shortly after one or more target behaviors is displayed, write down the corresponding number in the appropriate interval, like in the box. If the behavior is kind of long and it lasts between 2 intervals, or even if it just so happens to be right when one interval goes to the next interval, then you would actually write it down in both boxes. Step 4 is to write a vertical line for any intervals where there were no target behaviors displayed. And step 5 is to write your initials next to the behavioral data that you collected. Now I'll show you how to fill out a scatter plot. So let's suppose my client, Bruce Banner, has 3 target behaviors. Number 1 is yelling, number 2 is throwing things, and number 3 is slamming his fists into the ground or into the floor. So it's Sunday, my shift starts at 10 o'clock, and the first couple hours, Bruce is doing just fine. Then around 1 o'clock, I start to notice that he seems agitated. Now, being agitated is not one of our target behaviors, but of course, as his direct support professional, I'm noticing different changes in his behavior and how he's seeming. So then at 1:15, let's say he yells 4 times, and then he throws a TV remote across the room, storms back to his bedroom, and then stays there and calms down over the next couple hours. Now I want to show you how to fill that out. I'll start by drawing a vertical line through the first 3 hours of my shift. A vertical line means no target behaviors were displayed. Then in the 1 o'clock box, I would write a 1 for yelling and a 2 for throwing things. For our purposes, I don't need to write a 1 4 times, even though he yelled 4 times. I'm just simply recording, did this behavior take place at all during this half-hour interval? If the answer is yes, then I write down the number code for the behaviors that took place. So in the 1 o'clock box, there's a 1 and a 2. Then I write a vertical line for the next 2 hours because he did not display any more target behaviors. So it's pretty simple. Let's do one more together. The target behavior for our day program client, Tony Stark, is name calling. Tony is in my group from the time he arrives in the morning until he gets picked up. He arrives at 8:35. I'll leave the 8 to 8:30 interval blank because he wasn't here. For the next couple hours, Tony doesn't engage in any name calling. Then he gets into a disagreement with another staff member at lunchtime, around 11:25, and he calls the staff names intermittently over the next hour or so. The last instance of name calling takes place at about 12:35. So I'll mark the number 1 in 4 intervals because the behavior took place between 11 and 11:30, 11:30 and 12, 12 and 12:30, and 12:30 and 1. Even though it stopped at 12:35, which just barely gets into that interval, I'm still going to mark that one. Let's just say that Tony doesn't engage in any more name calling the rest of the afternoon. He's picked up at 2:45. So I'll draw the vertical line through most of the rest of the afternoon. Now, let's suppose that he engaged in a new problem behavior, such as taking other people's food. If that happened, say like at 11:40, then I can add a new behavior code at the bottom, just like this, and then put it in the interval where it belongs. Points of clarification. Mark the behavior in the interval 1 time, whether it happened once or whether it happens 100 times. Secondly, mark the behavior in each interval it occurred. Even if it only occurred at the very beginning or very end of the interval, put it in there. In each one. Thirdly, if a new problem behavior occurs, you can create a new code for it and start marking that on the scatter plot. Fourthly, know the operational definition. You got to know what the actual definition is of it. Is this counting as the behavior occurring, or is this not counting as the behavior occurring? Because that will inform what does and doesn't get marked on the scatter plot. And lastly, your initials. Put your initials next to every time you record data. I don't mean like every single interval. I mean each time you're on a shift, a day program, or if you're on an overnight shift, it would be on 2 different days for a residential. But put your initials next to the data that you collected. For this knowledge check, there are 2 scenarios. I'm going to tell you the scenario while you're looking at the scatter plot, and you have to figure out if any errors are made and which errors are made in the way the scatter plot is filled out. Scenario 1. Client Natasha Romanoff has 2 target behaviors: hitting others, number 1, and kicking others, number 2. At 2:25, she kicked one of her housemates, Clint, 3 times. There were no other behavioral incidents during the shift. You've got this. If you need to rewatch it, that's fine. But let's see if you can nail the answer. Ready? Go. Did you get it right? I hope so. But just in case you didn't, let's take a look. They wrote behavior code number 1, which is hitting others, when in fact they should have written behavior code number 2, kicking others, because Natasha kicked her housemate. They wrote it in the correct time frame, in the right box on there, and they signed their initials, so everything else checks out okay. Scenario 2. The next day at 10:25 a.m., Natasha had a major outburst that lasted 15 minutes. Throughout the outburst, she attempted to kick staff, actually kicking staff at both the beginning and the end of the outburst. There were no other behavioral incidents during the shift. Wow, really? 2 right answers? Hey, I know that was hard, so kudos to you if you got it right. But in fact, they made 2 errors. They forgot to sign their name, but also the behavior took place from 10:25 to 10:40, so it should have been in both the 10 o'clock and the 10:30 box. It's not hard to get this data collection stuff right, but it is a matter of paying attention to detail. ABC data charts. So in scatter plots, we're pretty much just answering one question. Did the behavior occur during this interval? Or during all these intervals? With ABC data charts, we're looking at actually what happened right before and right after the behavior. The A stands for antecedent. That's what happened right before. The B stands for behavior, the target behavior. And the C stands for consequence, whatever happens right after the behavior is displayed. And by consequence, we don't necessarily mean like a discipline given by a staff member. The consequence of like ripping a shower head off the wall might be that I get soaked. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a consequence of discipline. Now let's take a look at an example. I've seen the following behavior sequence at Walmart on more than one occasion, and perhaps you can relate. Young child is sitting in cart and whining while mom shops. As they go past the candy aisle, child says, "I want candy," or usually something specific like, "Get me the Skittles," or "Mommy, chocolate." Mom says, "No, not unless you're good." Child screams and throws a big tantrum. Mom, clearly frustrated and embarrassed, gets the candy and hands it to the child, who quickly calms down. So for filling out an ABC chart, if the target behavior was throwing a tantrum, that's going to be in the B box. Child threw a tantrum. The antecedent was that mom said no to child's request for candy. If we want to look at what's called setting events, that would be like being in Walmart or being in the cart by the candy aisle, things like that. But the antecedent is whatever happens right before the behavior, and in this case, it's mom saying no to the child's request for candy. The consequence is that mom got the candy for the child and the child calmed down. Now we'll cover the specific parts of an ABC data chart. The time and date, location, who is present. The antecedent, which can be boxes that you check off, or it can be open-ended where you write in it. The behavior, which is the target behavior, of course. The consequences, and this also could be check boxes or it could be open-ended. Some additional components can include the environment, the duration, or the results of consequences. Tips for filling out an ABC data chart. Number one, focus on the facts, just the facts. Things that are observable, things that if 2 or 3 or more people were looking at the same events, they would be able to describe the same things happening. And you can keep it simple on this one. Secondly, the antecedent is whatever happened right before the behavior, and it also must be observable. In other words, he was tired is not an antecedent. It might be true that he was tired, and it may have contributed to the behavior, but when we're looking at an ABC behavior data collection, there has to be behaviors. There has to be something that happened. So maybe he said bed 3 times. Maybe he yawned. Those could go in the antecedent box, but not he was tired. The behavior, the B, is the target behavior. And of course, as we've mentioned before, this must be clear between you and the behavior specialist, whoever it is that's asking you to record the behavioral data. You have to know what qualifies and what doesn't qualify as the behavior. The C is the consequence. What happened afterwards? One of the things that behavior specialists are looking for are what was gained or avoided. In other words, was a consequence of this behavior that she got access to her favorite such and such toy or candy or whatever? Or was it that she avoided something she didn't want to do? Like, because this behavior, right after this behavior happened, then the consequence was, well, she got out of doing something that she doesn't like to do. Thus, the behavior is probably being maintained by escape of that unpleasant thing. And so the consequence is just whatever happened right afterwards. But that's kind of what we're looking for in particular. And remember, the more that we just focus on observable, specific things that took place, the better for ABC charts. Here's a client example. Our client, Bruce Wayne, has verbal perseveration, meaning he talks about the same thing over and over again. And his favorite topic is bats, every kind of bat. And so on one particular day, a staff member asks him, "Hey, what are you doing tonight, this weekend?" And Bruce goes on and on talking about bats for the next 10 minutes. And the staff member keeps talking with him, attempts to redirect, doesn't work, but keeps talking with him. Here's another client example. Our client, Peter Parker, likes to elope. On a day when a fire drill was scheduled, the fire alarm went off. Then Peter tried to go running out of the building ahead of everybody, like really running. The staff member yelled, "No, stay with the group, Pete." And then Pete stayed with the group. Here's your chance to keep the streak alive or a shot at redemption. Watch the following video clip and decide what's the best way to fill out the antecedent. Here is the scenario. The target behavior for 45-year-old Logan is property destruction. One day, Logan went to the doctor's, and he came home and he seemed really agitated. He sat down in his chair in the living room watching TV. When the staff member on shift went to help one of his roommates back in the bathroom, she heard a loud sound out in the kitchen. She came running out and saw a kitchen cabinet sitting on the floor and saw Logan pulling at another kitchen cabinet, trying to tear it off, just like he must have done with the first one. She redirected him, and right away, Logan ran back to his chair, sat down for the next 15 minutes, and got calm. Well, hopefully that wasn't too hard. Remember, antecedents always happen immediately before the behavior. So the antecedent was the staff person was attending another client in the bathroom, not that he went to the doctor's earlier in the day. Although that could have affected things, it's not the antecedent. Now, on to the final knowledge check. Pay attention to the best way to fill out the consequence for the following scenario. Here's the scenario. The target behavior for 29-year-old client Harley Quinn is teasing her coworkers. One day, about a half hour before lunch, she took a bathroom break. On the way back from the bathroom, instead of going to her workstation, she went to another coworker's workstation. While she was there, she started teasing the coworker, and those around started laughing. Then her supervisor came over and asked Harley to go back to her workstation. Harley sulked and went back to her workstation, where she sat until lunch, not doing any work. Just like antecedents take place immediately before behavior, consequences take place immediately after behavior. In this case, the best way to fill out the consequence section of the ABC chart was option C. And I hope you nailed it. Maybe you're one of the rare people who got 5 out of 5 correct. Woohoo! Pat yourself on the back. Or maybe you're frustrated the timer didn't last long enough and you barely got 1 or 2 right. Either way, no worries. Put yourself to it and you'll collect great behavioral data. But for now, let's wrap this thing up. Well, we've made it to the end of the training. Oh yeah. Hey, let's do a quick review. 3 things. Number 1, data matters. Number 2, fill out your scatter plots accurately. Number 3, fill out your ABC data sheets accurately. Bam, you're done. You're good to go. Except there is a quiz, but it shouldn't be too hard. As long as you've made it this far and you've been paying attention, you'll be fine.